Boom. Welcome, 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 everybody. We are so glad that you are joining us for another edition of the Blah Poetry Spots presents Words and Shit, where we have a conversation with a poet every week so that you can get to know the person behind the poetry. My name is Chibi. So excited to be your host here. My co-host, joined again by the illustrious, as always, so shiny, so smooth,
Boom.
todo
welcome,
fresh.
welcome, everybody. We are so glad
Eddie Vega.
that you are joining us for another.
Hey. So fresh and so smooth, or fresh, clean, or I don't know.
All the beautiful things.
All of this stuff, yeah. I don't usually shave for a virtual audience, but today I did because it was time. That's what it came down to. It was time.
It was overtaking the rest of your gorgeously round face.
Yeah, and it was making the mask kind of difficult, and that we got to worry about that now.
Mm-hmm.
About masks.
Dandruff be a thing. In the new world.
Oh yeah.
Well, it's good to see you looking so fresh, looking so fine. So good for those of people that are joining us currently live on Facebook. Feel free to use the comment section to interact. We'll be monitoring it throughout the entire conversation tonight. And we are excited to bring in this poet. Eddie, who do we got on deck tonight, as if we don't know?
Well, it's actually more than just a poet. This is David Bowles, who's written more than just poetry. He's actually written some great work. He's a Mexican-American poet, author, translator from South Texas, where he teaches at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He has written several titles, most notably the award-winning Flower, Song, Dance, Aztec and Maya Poetry, The Smoking Mirror, and They Call Me Güero. They never call me that, but they call him Güero. His work has also been published in multiple anthologies, plus venues such as School Library Journal, Bookbird, Knowledge Quest, Rattle, Translation Review, and the Journal of Children's Literature. I don't see Medium on there, but I've read him on Medium, so that should be in there. And in 2017, he was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters. I don't think we've ever had anybody who's in that, have we?
Not to my knowledge, so it just
right.
sounds.
So this is a chingon. We have a chingon with us, a literary chingon.
In a big belt buckle. You won't see it on the show, but he probably has.
Exactly. So David, are you there? Where are you at? There he is.
I'm here. I was hiding behind a virtual black screen.
I know David because of my publisher, Flower Song Press, Edward Vidaure. And we've actually read at a few events together.
That's right.
In Ali and I think here in San Antonio. AWP.
Yes, one time in San Antonio. That's right. Yeah.
Very good.
So welcome to our show.
Where are you joining us from, David?
I am joining you from Donna, Texas, 5 miles from the border with Mexico. So here I am. En la mera frontera.
La mera frontera.
We got 3 Rio Grande Valley veterans in this conversation right now. I'm sure we'll hit on that topic at some point in time. But right now, because Eddie's known your work for a very, very long time. I just met you 20 minutes ago, and I can't wait to hear you perform some of your work. So we're going to hand it over to you, David, and please take it away.
Okay, cool. So I think what I'll do is I'll start reading from this one with the shiny little medal. They Call Me Güero. It is a novel in verse written in the voice of a 12-year-old Mexican-American kid, a Chicano kid, on the border, living down here and being a 7th grader and Trump's America. So that's something special. And the book has really resonated with people. It's my best-selling book. It's won nearly a dozen awards. It's a real blessing. And so I want to read a little bit from it to you. Border Kid. It's fun to be a border kid, to wake up early Saturdays and cross the bridge to Mexico with my dad. The town's like a mirror twin of our own, with Spanish spoken everywhere just the same, but English mostly missing till it pops up like grains of sugar on a chile pepper. We have breakfast in our favorite restaurant. Dad sips café de olla while I drink chocolate. Then we walk down uneven sidewalks, chatting with strangers and friends in both languages. Later, we'd load our car with Mexican Cokes and Joya, avocados and cheese, tasty reminders of our roots. Waiting in line at the bridge, though, my smile fades. The border fence stands tall and ugly, invading the carrizo at the river's edge. Dad sees me staring, puts his hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, mijo. You're a border kid, foot on either bank. Your ancestors crossed this river 1,000 times. No wall, no matter how tall, can stop your heritage from flowing forever like the Rio Grande itself. This next poem is called Checkpoint. On a road trip to San Antonio for shopping and Six Flags, Dad slows the car as we approach the checkpoint. All those border patrol in their green uniforms, guns on their belts. Mom clutches los papeles, our passports, her green card. She's from Mexico, a resident, not a citizen, by her own choice. At the checkpoint, a giant German shepherd sniffs the tires as the agents ask questions, inspect our trunk. My little brother squeezes my hand, afraid. My rebel sister nods and says her yes sirs, but I can tell that she's mad, the way her eyes get. We're innocent, sure, but our hearts beat fast. We've heard stories, bad stories. A cold nod and we're waved along, allowed to leave the borderlands, made a limbo by uncaring laws of people a long way away who don't know us, a quarantine zone between white and brown. I feel angry, just like my sister, but I hold it tight inside. We just don't understand why we have to prove every time that we belong in our own country, where our mother gave birth to us. Dad, like he can feel the bad vibes coming from the back seat, tells us to chill. It won't always be like this, he says, but it's up to us to make the change, especially los jóvenes, you and your friends. Eyes peeled, stay frosty, learn and teach the truth. Right now, what matters is San Antonio. We'll take your mom shopping, go swimming in the Texas-shaped pool, eat a big dinner at Tito's, order anything you want. And he slides his favorite CD into the battered radio. Los Tigres del Norte start belting out La Puerta Negra. Pero la puerta ni 100 candados van a poder detenerme. Not the door, not 100 locks. Ah, my dad, he always knows the right song. Skip ahead a little bit. I promise you that not all of the book is dark and somber, but 12-year-old Mexican-American kid in Trump's America, you're going to bump into some of this stuff. And one of the great things about being a Mexican-American kid is all the storytellers and historians that you have in your family. Like in this particular poem, Uncle Joe's history lessons. My Uncle Joe is the family chronicler, a cowboy philosopher, our local expert in Mexican-American history. He lived through most of it. One day, we head to the river, set up chairs in our favorite spot, a shady refuge at the edge of his ranch. When I was a chavalito, he says, watching the water flow, didn't nobody teach us about our gente, about the revolucion? They made the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo sound like a blow struck for democracy instead of the violent land grab it was. This should be Mexico, mijo. The border, it crossed right over us. Es más, when I was in elementary, they didn't let me call myself Jose. It was Joseph this, Joseph that, so I became Joe. And forget using Spanish. They caught you saying a single word, and bas, you got smacked. Spellbound and angry, I asked Uncle Joe if that's why he never went to college, even though he's so smart. Pues sí. Also, nobody believed in me. Fíjate, when I was in 7th grade like you, counselor asked me what I wanted to be. A lawyer, I said. That white lady almost laughed in my face. What? No, Joseph, you should go to a technical college, become a mechanic. No shame in hard work, vieja racista. Still, I kept at it, studied hard. But in high school, turned in a paper for world history about the Conquista. I worked so hard on it, did research, revised and edited, todo ese jale. Know what I got? An F. I'm not kidding. Teacher said it was too good, obviously plagiarized. After that, pues, I gave up. Gatekeepers weren't letting this Chicano through. Then he leans forward and looks at me, super serious, his eyes suddenly red with rage or sadness or hope. Even the chachalacos go quiet, like they're listening too. Don't you let them stop you, chamaco. Push right through them gates. It's your right. You deserve a place at that table. But when you take your seat, don't let it change you. Represent us, mijo, all the ones they kept down. You are us. We are you. I have an earlier book of poetry called Shattering and Bricolage that has my broken up, put together face on the front of it. And this has got a lot of, definitely not as narrative poetry aimed at such a young audience. And one of the poems was actually quoted on Criminal Minds, and it's one of my favorite poems, and it's the poem that got a lot of people on Facebook really excited, pinging me, hey, David, you were quoted on Criminal Minds. So I'm going to read from that one. It's called Kintsukuroi, and I don't know if y'all are familiar with what Kintsukuroi is, but it's that Japanese art form where they take an already crafted, glazed, and fired vase or bowl or whatever, and they break it, and they put the pieces back together using silver or gold or whatever, and you can see the seams. Kind of like Gloria Anzaldua's Koyushauki process, the way I think of it, which is kind of what this entire book is about, since inspired by Anzaldua. Like a hammer, deliberate or careless jostling child, life tumbles us from safe, oblivious heights to smashed to shards and scattering dust. Yet, though shattered, we may still have the fortune to feel warm, compassionate hands collect the fragile fragments of our broken selves. With care that glitters brighter than even the purest gold, they join the misshapen bits together, leaving a webbing fretwork of shimmering seams that forever remind us when wounds are healed by love, the scars are beautiful. And then I wanted to go back to talking about the border. Eddie, I think you probably heard me read this one in Brownsville. I can't remember if you were there when I read it. This is called "Let Me Bury My Son," near Brownsville, 1915, the height of La Matanza. On my knees, I beg for the love of God, Mr. Lawman, let me bury my son. They say he's a traitor, bandit, thief. My boy was only working at his uncle's side. We said nothing when your people took our land, bought up our ranches, pushed us south of town. We cast our eyes aside, picked up spade and hoe to work the soil where once our cattle grazed. Don't strip this final dignity away, good sir. Mr. Lawman, let me bury my son. All of you afraid of that plan hatched by rebels to cut you down as one. This isn't Mexico. We're Tejanos, faithful to our state. We seek no revolution. Federal troops and rangers far outnumber these brown-skinned, Spanish-tongued neighbors. A train has been derailed, I know. Bandits bolted back across the Rio Grande. Enraged, the troops returned to find my son at work with his uncle and others on one of your farms. Those calloused hands, would they ever lift a rifle, ever curl around your neck? My son's hands, even free of dirt, are not white. Evidence enough for you. Each hanged. A mother's grief at the loss of her son. Bereft, I traveled to that tall, bleak mesquite, wept to see my brother dead, howled to see my son. Rangers laughed. They would not let me cut him down. His limbs swelled tight against his clothes. They would not let me cut him down. The sun beat down and blacked his flesh. They would not let me cut him down. The flies, like smoke, then wreathed him dark. They would not let me cut him down. The vultures swarmed and pecked and tore. They would not let me cut him down. Still he sways from that noose, creaking in the wind. There are rites we must perform. Our God commands. Think of all these spirits curdling in shame. Think of vengeance brewing slow in the sandy soil. Show me that you're human. Even now there's time. By everything that's holy, let me bury my son. And I think I'll stop there so we can chat on that note.
All of those secrets.
Yes, tell you the secrets.
Do we have applause?
I will applaud myself. Yes.
All right. No, we applaud you. We applaud you too.
Thank you.
And that was a phenomenal.
I have the first question. The first question I have to ask is, what's it like having your poem quoted on Criminal Minds?
It's wild. Yeah, I mean, that's like, you get the Pura Pray, you get the Tomas Rivera, you get inducted in Texas Through Letters, but then you get fucking quoted on Criminal Minds. You're like, I made it. Damn.
Did they call you ahead of time, or?
No, I think they might have contacted the publisher, which is Lamar University Press. You know how poetry is. You get it published where you can, and I think they may have asked them for permission, but the editor didn't let me know, and so it was a surprise. It was it's a nice surprise, and it is now like my most quoted poem. Like, you literally can go on Twitter and just type in "When wounds are healed by love, the scars are beautiful," and you'll see thousands and thousands and thousands of posts where people have quoted me, and it's like all over. And so it's nice. It's a poem I really like. It kind of sums up something that I think is really important. A lesson that I learned from Gloria Anzaldúa's, Borderlands, and something I dedicated an entire book to. So the fact that people are, kind of virally sharing that makes me feel good. That's what you hope that.
And the
that
world.
this, well, yeah, yeah. Well, you know how poetry is. Poetry is not the best paying of the genres, and definitely They Call Me Güero, because it's a novel in verse meant for younger readers, has done much better. It also just came out at the right time. Trump had just been elected, and that year the conference of the National Council of Teachers of English happened in Atlanta, like within 10 days of the election, and a couple of scholars of poetry and poets that I know were doing a presentation to teachers at this conference, and the teachers afterwards came up to them and said, "Hey, we have students in our classroom who are beside themselves with anguish. They don't know what to do. We've got Latinx kids who have undocumented relatives who are frantic and are afraid of what might happen, that their loved ones might be deported. We have Muslim students who are worried about the Muslim ban. We have African American students who are worried about the cruel things that Trump has said down the years about Black people. And we need an anthology of poetry that will help these kids, that will allow them to like work their way through it." And so they put together an anthology like just in a couple of months. They reached out to me and asked me to contribute a poem. And it was that first one I read, Border Kid. And then Border Kid got...
Oh no.
I think we lost him. I wasn't sure if it was me, because but
no.
I'm wired in. I ain't on
El Paso.
And we're back.
Oh, what happened?
We kind of lost you for a little bit, for maybe the last 30 seconds or so.
Oh, wow, that's weird. It kind of froze.
You just said, we don't know what you said.
Oh, I was just kind of like talking about the origin of They Call Me Güero, and how, because of this anthology that was created in response to Trump's being elected and the emotional stress it was causing kids, my poem Border Kid was published there. It was reprinted in Journal of Children's Literature. I read it when I was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters, and that was when Cinco Puntos Press offered me a contract on the basis of that one poem. They said, "Can you write another 40 poems in a kid's voice?" And I said, "Yes, I can." They go, "Because we want to publish that book. We think it's important." And they weren't wrong. So,
let's talk about.
So then that's the secret to getting published by Cinco Puntos.
Get inducted into Texas Institute of Letters, yeah.
Getting on Criminal Minds.
Getting on Criminal Minds.
Let's talk about They Call Me Güero for a moment. Because like you said, it's a story about, a 12-year-old boy living in Trump's America, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, again, because the point of the show is to get to know the person behind the poetry. How much of this is a memoir and how much of this is fiction?
Sure, that's a fair question. I would say about 30% of it is pulled from my own life. I'm 50, so I was like Güero's age in 1982, and then he also is thinking about things when he was younger. So I'm pulling from my childhood and teen years in the Rio Grande Valley, but in the 70s and 80s, when time was, obviously much different then. But there are a lot of incidents and family relationships that I was able to pull into the present. And then I took another 30% probably from my son's life. So my son is now 19. When I was writing this, he was younger, he was still in high school. And so just thinking about his experiences as a Gen Z Mexican American kid living on the border, right? And then it's from the lives of other kids that I've taught, and then another 40% is just stuff that I made up. I think that it was important to me because I'm writing about. I mean, the title kind of gives it away. They Call Me Güero. The book centers on what it's like to be a light-skinned Mexican American. Some people get upset with me when I say a white Latino because they think that's like a horrible thing to call yourself. But there's privilege attached to being light skinned in our culture, clearly, and there's clearly a lot of colorism and so forth. And so being 12 and coming to grips with that, like Güero doesn't want to be light skinned. He wishes he were dark like his father. It's the same way I felt. I would like look at my dad's skin. Differently from Güero, like my mom is white and my dad comes from a Mexican American family. My mom comes from a white family. So it was even weirder for me because I had one cousin on my mom's side. I hardly spent any time with them. I spent all the time with the Mexican American family I had on my dad's side, but I was different from everybody else, being lighter skin. And so, the way I felt about that, I wanted to put that across because it's a common feeling for light-skinned people, and coming to grips with the fact that you don't like it, you didn't ask for the privilege, but you can't renounce the privilege. I don't know if you guys saw me like raging about this on Twitter for the past 2 days, basically trying to teach all of Mexico like to stop acting like there's no racism in Mexico. But like you have to come to terms with it. You have to say, okay, yes, there's privilege. I have privilege. I can't renounce my privilege. So what do I do about it? Well, what you do about it is you become anti-racist and you use your privilege to shield other people and to fight to pull down the system that has given you privilege that other people don't have. And like when you have to learn that when you're 12, that's hard. You just want to play and shoot bottle rockets at your cousins. Like one of my favorite poems in the book is Bottle Rocket Battle. So, yeah, I felt it was necessary to pull from my own life because my experience going through that had to inform what Güero's going through.
It's
what's interesting about that is like I've heard so many stories of brown kids or darker skinned kids in Mexican American communities who are as children are trying to wash away their dirt from their arms.
Yeah, I know.
They think that they're too dark.
Yeah. It is horrible.
And you're saying that you wanted to be darker.
Yeah. I did want to be darker. I didn't like being different from my cousins and from my dad and so forth. And it's a weird thing. I mean, I guess there's not all light-skinned people feel that way. I'm sure there are plenty of light-skinned Mexican Americans who are like, hell yeah, thank God I'm light-skinned, especially right now with Trump. This is a really good disguise. But depending on the time you live in, it could be worse or better. So.
I mean, it's an interesting perspective for this character, this 12-year-old to have, because like I remember, like I grew up on the border in Laredo, and I'm of a lighter skinned Latino, and still like growing up in my teenage years, I wanted to be even whiter. Like I have curly hair, so I would constantly like straighten my hair. I tried to stay out of the sun, because I wanted to be part of America, because it felt like embracing my Mexican side was just going to further alienate me. And it wasn't until much later that I came to embrace my culture and my history, despite my skin tone. So how was it for you, like as an adult, to write this 12-year-old's perspective, right? How do you
well, it was tricky for me because I did go through what you're talking about. See, my dad eventually abandoned us. He got in trouble with the law. He drove us away from the valley all the way to South Carolina, where we had lived for a couple years earlier when he was in the Navy when I was really young. And then just like abandoned us here. And so when I came back and my mom got a divorce, I was estranged from that side of my family. I was no longer in contact with the Mexican part of my family, and because I felt so much resentment towards him, it was easier for me to double down now on the white side of my identity and not correct people when they just assumed, especially with a last name like Bowles, that that I was white. And you know, people would say something in Spanish around me, and I'd be like, "Wait, te entiendo," and they'd be like, "Ah, you speak Spanish?" I'm like, "See," and they're like, "Well, you don't give any indication that you're Mexican American," because I wasn't trying to advertise it. I was hurting like in a major way. Like this man that I had loved so much had like done like the worst thing. I mean, I I considered suicide many times. I started like, you know, drinking and just doing a bunch of stupid stuff when I was a teenager and in my early college years. So I mean, I understand that impulse, but the impulse came when I felt like the culture that I love so much was rejecting me, and I was like, wow, okay, well, fuck you then, you know. And it was kind of probably like what happened to you. It took me when I was an adult, taking certain classes at college, beginning to read Mexican American authors, stuff like that, for me to start coming back around to embracing my Mexican American identity again, after having, you know, spent easily 5 years trying to pretend like I wasn't Mexican American. Yeah.
It's kind of the interesting part of, like, you know, growing up in the Valley, you almost forget that there is a white America happening outside of this bubble, right? When you grow up on the bubble, like 98% is, like you said in your poem, you know, this intermix of Spanish and English, nada que ver, you know, everything is just same old, same old. And it isn't until leaving that other people inform you that you are different. And when I say leaving that, I mean in both directions, going north into America and going south into Mexico, visiting family. I remember them saying, like, you have such
viene el pocho.
Spanish accent. And I was like, do I? Tengo acento? I mean,
yeah, we do. You had a South Texas accent, right?
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, those books that you had that kind of got you back in touch with your heritage, what were some of those books, some of those courses?
Yeah, so I mean, there were two key courses that like really kind of like woke me up when I was 19. One of them was an introduction to anthropology course, in which we studied like Aztec and Mayan mythology, and I was like, wait a minute, what? Because you know, you go to school in Texas, and it's changed a little bit now, but like when you and I were like younger, you go to school and they teach you about the Greek gods and the Roman gods and the Norse gods, whatever. And you're like living fucking, you know, just a few minutes from Mexico, and you never learn about a single Mesoamerican god ever. And so like that class just like blew my mind. I was like, holy shit, because I love mythology, and it just never even occurred to me to think about the indigenous sacred stories of Mexico. And so that was one thing. And the other one was in a world literature course. Get this, a world literature course. We read House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. Why in a world literature course when she is an American author? Because in 1989, that was the only place that Sandra Cisneros was going to get her fucking work read, was inside, you know, in this kind of like really like sneaky kind of way of easing her into the curriculum. Thank God things have changed. And then I realized, oh my God, wait a minute, Mexican Americans write? Because I wanted to be a writer, but I had become convinced in high school that it was the white side of me that was going to get me into writing, because that was the part, because all the writers that I read and that we were assigned in school were all white people, you know, non-Latinx white people. And so reading Sandra Cisneros then got me interested in, I started like reading every Mexican American thing I could put my hands on, Rudy Anaya stuff, and Tomas Rivera, and just like everything that I could find at the time. Americo Paredes, just everything. And those two things plunged me down this rabbit hole of like beginning to study how the folk tales that my grandmother Garza had told me when I was a little kid, how they connected to Mexico, these borderland stories connected to Mexico, how that connected to colonial New Spain, and how that also got connected to pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. And eventually I ended up studying like Nahuatl and translating from it. And it just, I mean, it was just, it's been this crazy, crazy ride. And I've noticed this, that sometimes, I don't know what it is about being like a light-skinned mestizo, you know, a white Latino or whatever you want to call us, where when we finally come around to embracing our identity, like we kind of like maybe go overboard. We go a little bit farther than is absolutely necessary, as if maybe we have something we're trying to prove. I'm not sure what psychological mechanism underlies that, but definitely I spent a lot of time just like really dig into my roots and lived in Mexico and in Monterrey for a couple of years off and on. My wife was from Monterrey, and just I don't know. It was this really interesting journey of discovery, because I basically got really pissed off. I was like 19 going on 20, and I realized that public education in the state of Texas had essentially like robbed me of any kind of connection to my heritage. And not only had it robbed me, it had robbed my father, it had robbed my grandfather, and then schooling in Mexico had robbed my great grandparents in Tamaulipas, and back centuries. Like who do you get mad at? Who do you punch? ¿A quién le metes un chingazo, right? You know, si todos te fueron borrando lo que es tu herencia. I mean, you know, it's a really tough situation.
Like little by little thing that happens that, you know, is what ends up creating, you know, systemic oppression, you know.
Yep. Yeah, it's never like at all at once. It's always bit by bit this erosion of your rights and your identity until you're suddenly left to drift with nothing.
It's kind of that poem you were talking about, where you mentioned your uncle, got me thinking about like the LA walkouts of 1968. You know,
oh yeah,
that kind of like systemicness, and we're seeing that happen right now. And before we dive into, you know, the politics of systemic racism and what our current state is and, you know, ideas on that, I want to ask you a quick side question, and then we can pivot on the idea of like history and ancestry. Have you done an ancestry DNA test, 23andMe thing to like?
Yeah. Several of us in my family did, just to get a feel for it. I mean, and you know, for somebody who is as interested in the indigenous present and past of Mexico, I mean, it's kind of disappointing to only be like 8%, but at the end of the day, you know, it's mestizaje, man. You know, light skinned, maybe like overwhelmingly European, Mexican Americans on one side, you know, a mishmash of European on the other side. It gets attenuated in me, but that's true of, you know, people living in Mexico. And it's one of the things that I was, you know, that I've been talking about on Twitter is, you know, there are plenty of largely European people who are Mexican citizens, whose families have lived for centuries there, who haven't really mixed in with the darker, browner, more like la gente morena, la gente indígena, los Afro-Mexicanos, and have, you know, so if you come from Mexico, that's why it's important to understand that there's like that being Mexican American, it's racialized in the United States, but I prefer not to look at it that way. To me, it's an ethnic or cultural identity. Being Mexican American, what joins us together are our cultural or ethnic you know, bonds. I have plenty of friends. I have a brother, Fernando, who is Afro-Mexicano. He's a black Mexican, a Blaxican, as he says sometimes. And you know, we have a variety of things. Like you can have brothers and sisters and cousins like going together somewhere, and there's going to be like this wide range of tonalities. And you know, it's an important thing to keep in mind that that exists, that whiteness exists, and it's a part of many of our identities.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Like it's a cultural thing, because, you know, that country got colonized and conquered and invaded and imported by so many different that los mexicanos son una mezcla, right? You know, we are a mix of genetics, but it's the culture that brings us together.
Right? And at the same time that is true, it's also true that among that mixture, there are still people who are largely indigenous. There are still completely indigenous communities in Mexico. There are Nahua communities. There are Zapotec communities. I have a house on the coast of Oaxaca in una comunidad zapoteca, así una aldea zapoteca donde hay como 20 familias, and if you want a piece of land there, you have to go to the heads of the families and explain to them why you would make a good neighbor and stuff like that. So there are communities still there. And then also in Oaxaca, when you go down to the Costa Chica, there are entire fishing villages that are all of them are Afro-Mexicanos. And so there's simultaneously like a kind of an overwhelming, or maybe a majority that are kind of like this weird mestizaje that they don't know what indigenous background they really have, but we can't pretend like that's the only Mexican identity. That's where a lot of the troubles nowadays come from, when people saying, oh, there's no racism in Mexico because we're all mestizos. Some of us are just lighter and some of us are darker. And you're like, no, motherfucker, it's not that easy. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I used to live in Veracruz, and we did
mucha
work
gente negra en Veracruz, sí.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they would say that. One of my friends said that Veracruzanos were gente mole because they were made with a lot of different chiles. Anyway, but
as long as the Veracruzanos themselves are fine with that, I think it's cute.
Yeah, that's how you describe
If they don't like it, then I wouldn't. Yeah, okay, good, right?
Yeah. I never said that to anybody, but yeah, he told me. But Oaxaca is known as being a state where there's more people who speak indigenous dialect than those who speak Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's a really, really rich place.
Like what we call, gente indígena, or sometimes, Indio, which would be derogatory. But I want to talk more about language because you speak or you write in Nahuatl. And I guess you kind of answered where that came from, but what are some of the, I guess, the poetics of the language, or what could it bring? What kind of richness does it bring to your work?
Yeah, one of the really cool things about Nahuatl poetics, one of it is like the language itself has these wonderful mechanisms for constructing words that are maybe even like an entire poetic line, because it's an agglutinating language, so you're able to like bring all these things, all these different components together to create like really, really long words and be very fanciful and poetic. And a lot of Aztec poetry contains that sort of stuff. They have lots of very novel words that are being made up by the poet. Sometimes you kind of get the feeling that on the spot they're creating these new words. Then you also have these ecstatic noises that are made. One of the interesting, there are two codices that contain all of the pre-Columbian or colonial era Nahuatl poetry, about 120 poems altogether, 120 cuicatl, the songs, because I guess they didn't have a writing system, so they didn't like write them down. They were recited and sung and learned, passed mind to mind over the generations. But if you can imagine like a Michael Jackson song, imagine you were to get like somebody's like, sing Billie Jean to me, right? And they're singing it and they're doing all the oh, ooh, ah, and you're transcribing the words and you're transcribing the ah and oh and stuff like that. That's essentially what happened in these codices, because they were Franciscan priests who would send people out into the community to say, have them sing the songs to you, write them down. We want to, keep as many of these as possible. So there's a lot of that, a lot of these what are called ecstatic vocables, just kind of like shouts from the spirit, cries of the heart to the gods or whatever. And then just like thematic, like a lot of the imagery, the flower is such a prevalent image, and it can represent so many things, because a flower is beautiful, but it's also fragile, and it doesn't last very long. Its existence is fleeting. It's often taken to represent friendship, because of course the majority of these cuicatl are written or composed by men who were warriors, noblemen who were warriors, who would go off to battle and believe that dying in battle was a sure way to get into the paradise of the sun, right? The house of the sun in the east. So they saw it as something that you should aspire to, but simultaneously, it was something that meant that you were going to leave behind your friends, your companions, and that was a really hard thing to grapple with. So the songs were like flowers, but also your friends were like flowers. And so there's lots of playing around with that idea of the fleeting nature of friendship and why you have to savor it now, because tomorrow on the battlefield, you may be, reaped by Huitzilopochtli and, taken into the house of the sun in the east. It's this really interesting tension.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, when they think about, Aztecs, they think about, bloodthirsty, sacrificing on the pyramids, stuff like that. But a lot of the poetry is just so very human, so very like people tell me that after death, there's this paradise that awaits me, but we don't really know. Maybe I'm going to die and maybe I'll be in no place. And that's horrible. I love my life. I love my friends. And see, all of these really thematic things like connect to me really, really deeply. The poetics itself, like the rhythms and rhymes and so forth, the rhyme schemes, if you can call them that, don't work in English very well. So there's not a lot of influence there, but definitely thematically and in terms of maybe just like playing around with certain types of metaphors, because Nahuatl is also a very metaphorical language. They use they're kind of like kennings. We call them difrasismos, where they use two different words. Like the very word for poetry is in Xochitlincuicatl, which means the flower, the song. Sometimes they run together, Xochicuicatl or Xochincuicatl, depending on what dialect you're using. And that's where the name for Flower Song Press came from, because poetry is flower song. Yeah.
It's an interesting point you bring up, and I'm curious because, full disclosure, you're the first translator I've ever had a conversation with. It's kind of like take Don Quixote, right? There are fantastic translations of Don Quixote, but like nothing compares to reading it in its original language.
Yeah. Yep.
So as a translator, how much liberty do you have to take to like get the essence of the text across, and also how many horribly vehemently angry conversations have you had with other translators who didn't how to do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that drove me to start studying classical Nahuatl, because let's be clear, the language that I have studied for 10 years and that I translate from and that sometimes I write in, because I write some original poetry in Nahuatl as well, is classical Nahuatl, the language as it was spoken 500 years ago. And there are many varieties of Nahuatl today that I don't really understand. I will catch 40-50% of what's written in them, and I am not like I'm not going to be holding a conversation with anybody anytime soon, because there are not a lot of people out there that have studied classical Nahuatl. But the translating from it requires you to be like a co-recreator of the song, of the poem. There's no way for you to render into English and have it be as beautiful for your normal reader of English poetry, what is written in Nahuatl. And so what used to get me upset was I would see like a couple different things happening. First of all, some of the first translations I came across in English were translated by like anthropologists or archaeologists or just like linguists, and they were like straight, dry calques of the lines, just telling you literally what they say. No music, no rhythm, just a straight calque of what's being said, which is fine for just comprehension, but terribly unsatisfying in terms of like if you like to like read poetry and really get into it. Yeah. And then I'm going to try to give myself a little more light here. Okay. Because it's getting dark outside and I have the windows open and it's like I'll slowly be wreathed by darkness. By the end, it'll just be like my eyes shining in the screen.
We have had that conversation.
It had to happen before.
Yeah.
nothing but like a small glimmer of a person.
Yeah, it'll be funny. I'll read like a really somber poem at the end. And then other poems like tried to be more poetic, but often what they would do is they leave a bunch of Nahuatl words untranslated and take that kind of tact of like making it, they want to like make it feel like really Aztec-y. And to me, that's exoticizing. Like when an Aztec was listening to the poem in Nahuatl, he wasn't like, oh, listen to these, these great words in our language. They were just enjoying the emotion, the movement of the poem. And so, your job, I think, as a translator of poetry is to recreate in a modern audience as close as you can the feeling that somebody 500 years ago would have had. And you can't recreate it perfectly. So it's always there's that great saying that the translator is a traitor, right? You're betraying the text to some extent. But if you are a poet as well as a translator, then what you're doing is you're creating a poem in your language, in the target language, that has the soul of the original. Okay, it's like it's reincarnated in the flesh that you've created for it. Some people will find that really unappealing, but I find it like just super invigorating, because when it happens, when you do it well, it's this really exciting thing. And my first book of translation, Flower Song Dance, won a translation award from the Texas Institute of Letters and so forth, and that was a really rewarding thing to like get up in front of these people, a lot of them like older white people from North and East Texas, and read these Aztec, these Mexica poems to them, and have them like go, oh my God, these people had beautiful sentiments and they were deeply human and cared about the same things that I do. And I was like, yeah, motherfuckers, what did you think? That they were like monsters or something? Yeah. So that's what's rewarding, because the majority of people are not going to learn Nahuatl to read those. And so that part of it is reserved for a very small number of people who have the privilege and the time and resources to study the language.
Well, is there a name for that kind of construction? The one you talked about where you thought it was kind of like fetishizing, or where it was like they kept the Nahuatl in there.
Yeah, it's exotic. Yeah, they're exoticizing the
But is there a word for it? And the reason why I'm asking there's a word for it is because the same thing happens in the Bible. In the New Testament, when they translate the Gospel, there are some parts of it that are still in Aramaic, like Talitha Kum, little girl get up, or the Golgotha, the place of the skull. Those are actually Aramaic. They're not Greek.
They're not Greek.
They kept the original language or whatever, and they're called targums. So I didn't know if there was like a similar word. But the interesting thing, I think, and this is the switch, is that instead of it exoticizing the Aramaic, it seems that people think, well, the reason why that was kept is because that was important, and that may or may not have. It's more probability that was the actual
words of Christ,
words of Jesus or whatever.
Because he wasn't speaking Koine Greek; he was speaking Aramaic, right? Yeah. And I mean that kind of thing makes sense. But like, think about the context of the writing of the Gospels. You have people, years after Christ has died, who are like, oh, like everybody who was around when he was preaching is getting ready to pass away. We need to like write this stuff down. We need to put his words to paper, instead of just like repeating them and remembering them. And so they start writing them down. And by that time, a lot of his followers speak Latin and Greek and so forth, because we're talking decades, right? I'm looking at it from a non-Christian perspective, by the way. So it's, the Gospels are written decades after his death, and they're written down in Greek, and so people are remembering snatches of things that were said in the original language, and they're putting it down. When that's one thing, right? Written in Greek with snatches of Aramaic. That would be like if the poems were written in Nahuatl with snatches of Otomi, or some other, or Chichimeca or something like that. But when you translate it into English, when you translate the Bible into English, do you keep the phrases in Aramaic still in Aramaic, or do you translate them like you translate the Greek? These are difficult decisions to make. A place name you're going to leave the same. You know, why would I translate Coatepec, which means the Snake Hill? Why would I make it Snake Hill? You know, why would I translate the name of Huitzilopochtli to Southern Hummingbird or left-handed hummingbird instead of just calling him Huitzilopochtli? It seems there's like you've got to make decisions. You know, left-handed hummingbird was on Snake Mountain. It just, I don't know. To me, that takes it too far. Like, you just don't translate names. And I'm sure people would probably prefer, like a lot of English speakers would prefer it, because Nahuatl names are hard to pronounce if you don't speak Nahuatl or Spanish.
What do
Anyway.
you call the state bird of Texas?
Huh?
What do you call the state bird of Texas?
What do I call the state bird of Texas?
Yeah. Like, what do you personally refer to it as?
Oh, what is the state bird of Texas?
Oh,
I forget.
What is this?
It's the mockingbird.
A mockingbird, the Sinsotli.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Is like, this is a conversation I had with somebody earlier, I think last week, about how boring English is with regards to birds. They saw a blackbird, they call it blackbird, they call it bluebird. This is the mockingbird. There's a redbird, you know, and in the name that I prefer, I don't like saying mockingbird because it's kind of, I think it's rude to the mockingbird, you know. So Sensotle though comes from the Nahuatl, right?
It comes from Nahuatl, yeah.
And it means something different.
Right. Well, it means possessor of 400.
Yeah.
And 400 what? 400 voices.
400 voices. 400
yeah.
songs.
So it just means literally the word means possessor of 400, and the assumption is it's 400 voices, 400 songs, whatever, right? Like, can you imagine if you translated that from Nahuatl? Like, if we didn't have the word mockingbird, and somebody was like, "Oh shit, we got to translate the name of that bird. What is it in Nahuatl?" And you're like, "Oh, okay, 400 possessor, haver, 400 haver." No, it doesn't work.
Birds. No, we wouldn't do that. Something sounds way prettier though than mockingbird.
Yeah, it does. It does, but we hear it differently than a Nahuatl speaker 500 years ago would hear it, because they would hear to them, they would be hearing a kind of, frankly, just boring, rudimentary name. Like, there's nothing magical. It sounds magical, but there's nothing magical about the meaning. Just it's very, and I mean that's like what I'm talking about. You see Coatepec, or we say Quetzalcoatl, and it sounds like ooh, Quetzalcoatl, but it's just feathered serpent. It literally it's literally Quetzal snake. A Quetzal snake. What's a Quetzal? It's a bird with like beautiful plumage, right? A Quetzal snake.
But there's
like,
there's so much more story and so much more richness in the name.
Oh, that's why I would never want to translate it Quetzal snake, or, I mean, feathered serpent is a slightly more elegant way of putting it. And like, I have a book that's titled Feathered Serpent, Dark Art of Sky, because there are so many, different languages in which Quetzalcoatl is called something akin to feathered serpent, Kukulkan, Gugulmuts, depending on what dialect of Maya you're talking about, or what like Mayan language you're talking about.
I want to get back to the publishing thing a little bit.
Yeah.
And Vincent Cooper, I think he was on. I don't know if he's still on. And we
ya se rajó el pinche Vicente.
Before we pivot, though, I just want to point out that this conversation is exactly why the show is called Words and Shit, because we're going to talk about words, and we're going to talk about all sorts of shit, including birds and that. And I think this has been phenomenally educating.
But not Vincent Cooper. Vincent Cooper's not.
Vincent Cooper is he's gonna dude, you better get back on, Benny. I'm just telling you.
I think he might still be here. I don't know. But anyway,
he better. I'm sorry, if Eddie is leading me astray and you actually are listening to me, then I apologize. Carnal, ya sabes que te quiero. Don't worry about it.
But we asked him a very similar question because of his name, about getting published as a Chicano, with a last name that isn't what people normally think of Chicanos.
Yeah. I did a list. I need to like share it again. I did a list on Twitter because somebody like I was like on a panel and somebody's like, "There's not a single Latinx person on the panel," and I'm like, "I'm Mexican American," and then I was like, "You know what? Let's talk about this. Let's talk about the fact that you don't have to have a Spanish surname to be to be Latinx. There are, the entire I'm exaggerating, but like the entire country of Argentina doesn't have Spanish surnames. They're like all like Italian and German surnames, whatever. Yeah, people's identities are complex, and like neither Vinny nor I should have to like be explained to anybody why our last names are not, Garza or Perez or Cervantes or whatever it happens to be. But yeah, I mean, it is. People do ask the question, why are you writing about this? Because it's my culture.
I mean, Ruben, even in music, like Ruben Blades has come out and said, like, I prefer my name to be Ruben Blades, not Ruben Blades.
Yeah.
And it's just the name does not pin the history or the story, right? Or the
Sure. But and on Twitter, I came up with a list of like 200 and something authors, Latinx authors who have last names that are not Spanish. It's just the way it is. We've got French last names, German last names, Chinese last names, Japanese last names. Mexico City, 50 years after the conquest, already had a Chinatown. They had a huge Filipino population, Chinese, Indian. There are, that is interwoven into the very DNA of the Mexican culture, especially from the DF. And like pretending that you have to have a Spanish surname to be a legit like Chicano, that's kind of unfortunate. Yeah.
Let's talk about publishing, because in poetry, I mean, you said it earlier, you get published where you can, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And it's such a different beast. This past year, AWP was here in San Antonio, and I sat in on a panel about publishing. And 15 minutes into it, clearly it was a panel about fiction writers publishing. And I was like, this is not the kind of beast that poetry publishing is.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about like your experience in publishing and like indie publishing versus like the big five publishing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's easier to publish poetry and through an indie press. I think that there's more satisfaction to doing it that way anyway. You have greater control, and as a poet, you want to. Poetry can't be edited in the same way that prose can. When I am, I've got books coming out from HarperCollins and Penguin Random House, and when I'm working with editors at those like big five on a fiction novel, I mean, they get in there and they tear out the guts, and I get manuscripts all marked up, whatever, and we do like a deep dive into rewriting prose because they're marketing it to a much larger audience, and it needs to to fit certain market trends and so forth, because they're investing a lot of money. They're paying me like a nice advance and blah, 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 blah. So yes, that's a different story. Poetry is a much more intimate, personal thing, and you can't work with an editor in that same way. They can't be like, they can't be screwing around with your shit that way. And an indie editor of a small press is going to understand that, or an editor at like a university press. They're looking to enhance your voice, to maybe make your lines like sing a little bit more clearly, where because we all have those moments where like everything else in the poem works except that the one line that we just can't get right, and sometimes another person stepping in and saying, why don't you try this, rearrange. Like I remember having Carmen Tafoya edit a poem of mine one time where she was literally, if you take these two lines and move them up to this stanza and then displace those lines down here. And I was like, what? And then I tried it and she was totally right. So sometimes it's all it takes. And small presses, indie presses, they can do that. And poetry, because it's so performative, because you usually want to get up and read it, lends itself, smaller books, you could schlep them around, sell them at those venues. And there are some really, really fantastic indie presses out there, like Aztlan Libre Press, Cinco Puntos, Arte Público, Flower Song. There's lots of like little Broken River, like all these little presses out there that will very carefully and in a loving way work with you to produce something that you're going to be proud of, because no matter who publishes your poetry book, you're not going to sell a whole lot of copies. So like you can't like, because it's poetry, guys. I mean, especially if we're talking about poetry for adults like this, Shattering and Bricolage, before it was quoted on Criminal Minds, like so una baba, gané una baba con este pinche libro, right? It's like, yeah, but and this is one of the things that I told Edward Vidaurre. If you're a poet and you want to keep writing poetry, but you also like want to make some money, write a novel in verse for teens. That shit is in right now. A novel in verse written by like a Chicana, grappling with, telling the story of a young Latina's life, coming of age, blah 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 blah. You'll have agents knocking on your door, you'll sell that and you'll make money on it. So if you're a poet and you want to make money on the side, think about writing for younger people. They Call Me Güero has sold like nearly 50,000 copies. Like I say, it's a blessing. It's a wonderful thing. You don't usually sell that many copies of the book. When it was published, Cinco Puntos was like, oh, so how many copies of this should we print? Normally, a poetry book, they'll print like 1,000 copies, and they'll be lucky if they sell that over the course of like 2 or 3 years, right? So like, well, let's print, 3,000, like 1,000 hardcover, 2,000 paperback. They sold out like in a month, and it's like already on its 5th printing, because writing for young people, writing the stories that these young people need to hear in verse, giving them a voice, letting them see themselves as poets. There's a need for that kind of thing. Writing our more traditional poetry, that's for a more sophisticated adult audience. That adult audience is pretty sophisticated and it's pretty small. And a lot of the people that are into reading poetry are poets themselves. And so it's a complicated thing. And you're much better off going with the small press than trying to get, like, I don't know, Penguin to buy your poetry manuscript, because they're not going to buy your poetry manuscript.
Young adult.
You write differently to an audience of young people.
I'm sorry, what?
How do you write differently to an audience of young people than is to the adult audience?
Word choice, of course, but. Well, sure. I mean, there's word choice, but there's also like content choice, and like, you have to, like, when you're writing for like a middle grade audience, like upper elementary and middle school, like the things that they're concerned about, the journey that they're going through, it's not like an internal journey. It's not all like angsty and interiorized. It's like trying to fit into the larger society. And they have lots of mentors and people helping them out, whatever. So when you write for them, you have to take that into account. You have to think about their psychology and what's developmentally appropriate for them, I guess you could say. Writing for teens is a little bit more like writing for adults, like writing for high school students. The Poet X by Liz Acevedo, an incredible YA novel in verse and she and I, because we won a lot of the same awards, but just like I got the middle grade and she got the YA, we were in a lot of the same places last year, and I got to hear her read a lot of that stuff. And that poetry, that resonates with adults just as well as it does with kids. So writing for teens, I think, is a little bit closer, but still the language tends to be different. It tends to be obviously more narrative. It's not a lot of like dense, obscure,
It's its own beast, and
yeah, it is totally.
Just the one privileged time that I had the chance to go to AWP, there were like a ton of panels on like writing for young adults, right? Because it's such a unique audience, right? That requires its own kind of crafting and attention. And if we had 3 more hours, I feel like we could sit here and pick your brain and just get a free masterclass on writing it. I feel like this past hour has really felt like a masterclass in so many different genres. You really have imparted so much wisdom.
Well, thank you.
A lot of different topics. There are things on my list that we ain't gonna get to.
Yeah. That is invariably what happens with me. I I definitely like take off with the question and run with it for 15, 20 minutes. So apologize there.
No, and I think we are all much more fortunate and blessed because of it. So
yeah, well, that's very kind of you to say.
Really appreciate you and the time that you've spent with us. Eddie, any last words?
No. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had a whole list. I don't have it on my piece of paper like you did. It's kind of scribbled, and it's also in my head. And yeah, I wish we could maybe do like a debate show where they have like the one conversation and then they have the other conversations that they publish later.
Right.
We want to work on that, but we don't have a lot of time.
All I could say is I'll come back anytime you guys want me to, and we'll chat more. Don't worry about it. I'm down for it whenever.
I love it. This has been, I think, a very enlightening conversation for a lot of people. I think you've definitely provoked a lot of thought that people are going to have to go back and ruminate on and really digest because of your history and the different genres that you navigate. You really have brought a fantastic voice to this show and this conversation. We appreciate you being here, David.
Thank you so much, man.
It would be our privilege if you would close us out with one more poem.
Sure. I'm going to read something that I haven't read in a very long time from Shattering and Bricolage called Rhyme Ran to Rap. Rhyme ran to rap, nudged roughly by Milton, slanting along Dickinson's tongue, taking the road less traveled by smug-faced, black-clad elitists. Rhyme ran to rap, hustling through the Harlem Renaissance, tapping her feet to bluesy, gospel-soaked jazz while chanting hymns in blessed stupor. Rhyme ran to rap, skipping rope and laying the dozens on beatniks and hippies who smirked at her childish antics, 'cause posy ain't music. Rhyme ran to rap on platform shoes, spinning vinyl late into the night, climbing with funky steps that sugar hill. Rhyme ran to rap and danced for a time on a hustler's lap, then slung Billingsgate at sucker MCs, grabbed guns aimed straight for Luck's bum knee, stuttered thundering from the lips of thugs, slipped fluttering down breasts, hips, and bums till she evolved into a dreadlocked muse who inspired bards of all creeds and hues to embark on a lyrical hero's trek that could lift their gifts from the streets and protect the legacy of the human race, preserved in words that can't be erased because their sounds burrow deep in every mind, encoding our struggle in a weft of rhyme. Gracias, que les vaya muy bien.
Thank you once again. Mr. David Bowles coming to us from Donna, Texas, deep South Texas.
Doneños dominan.
I'm not, let me just clarify, where exactly near is what, Donna? Where? Who? You know?
Donna is between McAllen and Harlingen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, halfway between McAllen and Harlingen.
I'm a fake Rio Grande Valley person because I grew up.
You're from Laredo, yeah.
I'm sorry.
But I love Laredo. Laredo's great, man. You guys take care. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
David, before you leave us, somebody wants to find your work besides Barnes and Noble.
Yeah. Man, go to my website, davidbowles.us. I've got tons of poetry that's been published online, linked there. You can find links to short stories, to translations, to all kinds of stuff, and links to my different books and Medium articles that, as Eddie was talking about.
Awesome. David
Bowles. Follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter? Follow
me on Twitter at David O. Bowles. You will not be disappointed because oh man, I do some crazy shit on that site. So come follow me. Don't bother with Facebook. Facebook sucks.
Somebody mentioned that in the comments. Actually, they said they love to see you on Twitter and so to read you on Twitter and everything that you give to them. That you're very educational.
I want Twitter to be a beautiful place where people can learn wonderful things and we can talk smack about the losers who don't see it that way.
Eddie and I were talking earlier, and he was like, "But have you seen his Twitter feed lately?" And I was like, "Oh, this is going to be a good conversation."
Man, we didn't get to the stuff but yeah, no, I will come back. I'm sure that we can have a special edition.
Part two, yeah.
Yeah, part two with El Chingon. Nos vemos. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us,
Eddie. Hey, what's next week?
Oh, I got a few announcements. Okay, we gonna wait to next week. First, though, for those of you who don't know, we're now on a podcast form too. Okay, So that's out there. I know we're on Spotify. We might be on Apple Music and a few other platforms. I need to go log back in and check to see where she's at right now. But the Blah Poetry Spot Presents Words and Shit is on a podcast. Right now, there's only a trailer, but tomorrow we'll be uploading our first episode. And we're going to start right back at the beginning, you know? So if you missed our conversation with Rooster and have a long drive ahead of you, or need to be cleaning the house and can't sit in front of the screen, you know, and watch the conversation, you can listen to it on our podcast. So super excited for that advancement. And then yes, next week, it's personally one of my favorite people in this world, and one of the most accomplished spoken word poets that of our generation anyway. Ebony Stewart, the one and only Gully Princess, is going to be joining us on Words and Shit the day before my birthday. So I'm going to take it as a birthday present to me, her presence here.
That's awesome.
So I'm sure that's going to be a phenomenal conversation. So please tune back in, same time, same place, next week, 7:30. And if you're interested in developing your own work and sharing your own work, the Blah Poetry Spot is live every Monday night. So tune into that. Every other week is a workshop or a open mic. And next week we have a workshop, correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's a switch. From now on, Blah Poetry Spot will be every other week. Starting next week, we're going to have a workshop, and the following week, on that Monday, we will have the open mic, and then go back to the workshop, back and forth. And it's all on through Zoom and Facebook Live. So
we're doing what we can in these.
Doing what we can.
Yeah. So
we're getting through this.
Thank you again, Eddie. Thank you, everybody
Thanks,
who's in live or who's watching afterwards. You know, like, just thank you for being here and spending this time and keeping poetry alive. My name is Chibi. That one's Eddie. Actually, that one's Eddie over there. Y'all stay safe. Good night.
Good night.